Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, participants, our next speaker is Mr. Hugh Lovatt, Coordinator for Israel-Palestine in the European Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, he worked as a researcher for the ICJ and as a Schuman Fellow in the European Parliament's Middle East Euromed unit. Mr. Lovatt also worked for the Aga Khan University's Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations, where he specialized in Islamic law. Thank you to have you, Mr. Lovatt, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me start off first with two small observations. The first one is a disclaimer that despite our name, which can be a bit misleading, the European Council on Foreign Relations has nothing to do with any EU institutions. You may or may not be surprised to know that often people misunderstand who we're talking for. And I'd hate to get any EU officials in trouble for what I'm about to say. The second one, I think, is just another observation, which is quite interesting. We are here in Brussels. And I think it's interesting how little the EU has been talked about over the last few days. And when it has been talked about, it seems to be in very negative terms. I think some of that is justly deserved on the EU's part. But I think also being dismissive or not really paying attention to what the EU has been doing over the last few years is perhaps missing a trick. Now, I don't want to oversell what the EU has done or can do, and as ever, the big issue is the lack of political will. And we have, today, tomorrow, as was mentioned, the European Parliament is currently negotiating on a resolution on Israel-Palestine. The EU High Representative for Foreign Policy, Federica Mogherini, will be outlining her vision for solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict tomorrow. We have Netanyahu visiting the UK also, France, which has been debating its own initiatives. So a lot has been happening over the last few years and will continue to happen. But I think it's very much worth underlining the following point is no matter how much the EU or the US thinks about initiatives or no matter how much positive thinking there is, at the end of the day, a Palestinian state will only be created when the Israeli public decides that its interests are best served by moving towards de-occupation. Unfortunately, that is what's going to be required. Now, in this context, I do think the EU has a very useful and impactful tool at its disposition that it can use in order to start affecting, or at least starting to alter, the set of cost-benefit calculations that currently underpin Israeli public support for the status quo. At ECFR, we've given this nascent policy, if you will, a name. We call it EU differentiation. And this was the subject of a recent report of ours. Now, EU differentiation, and we need to be very clear about this, is based on legal necessity. It's the EU's legal obligation of non-recognition of Israeli settlements. This non-recognition is an obligation not just when it comes to Israeli control over the West Bank and the Palestinian territories. It applies to other conflicts, as we've seen. Someone mentioned Crimea. Now, the degree to which the EU respects its own rules and regulations varies. In Crimea, it's gone quite far and been very forceful in pushing this non-recognition. Towards Israel and the OPTs, less forcefully, but it has nonetheless done some things. And at the base of this, at the root of this non-obligation requirement is an obligation to ensure that EU actions in no way assist in Israeli policies which violate international law when it comes to occupation in Israel-Palestine. And it's also a necessity for the EU to ensure that Israeli settlements in no way benefit from EU-Israel ties, from EU-Israel bilateral agreements. In other words, the EU has, over the last few decades, deepened its relations with Israel. Israel outside of Europe, after Switzerland and Norway, is the country that has the most benefited from contacts and links to the EU. It is the country that has been the most integrated into the day-to-day workings of the EU and its member states. And this, I think, gives the EU quite a bit of leverage, merely by having to respect its own legal obligations. There's no political considerations involved in this. And we have seen instances of the EU respecting this obligation. Now, it's not comprehensive, and it's so far done in an ad hoc manner, but it stems from the same legal necessity, which is based on, as I said, international law and the EU's own rules and regulations. So, for example, we've seen the EU clarify that Israeli settlements cannot benefit from preferential trade tariffs under the EU-Israel Free Trade Agreement. As has been mentioned previously, we've also seen the EU in July 2013 issue these famous funding guidelines, basically saying that Israeli settlement entities are not eligible to receive EU funding. And actually, these guidelines, and I think it's very much worth pointing out, that these interpret existing legislation in such a way that actually they are binding on the EU institutions. They are not binding on member states. But at least when it comes to EU money and funding through research and development projects such as Horizon 2020 and other things, it is very clear that Israeli settlements and activities undertaken by Israeli entities in the occupied territories are not allowed to receive EU funding. The EU has also, for instance, or I should say member states, have issued business advisories warning their own businesses of the legal and reputational risks of implicating themselves in dealings with Israeli settlement-linked entities. We've also seen the current discussion about labeling. All of this, again, stems from legal necessity to ensure that Israeli settlements do not benefit from agreements with Israel. We've also seen the EU enforcing its non-recognition of Israeli authority in the OPTs and settlements. And this will seem very, very silly and technical, but one of the biggest achievements for the EU has been excluding settlement poultry products from EU markets. Basically, because the EU does not recognize veterinary checks in settlements, it cannot certify Israeli poultry from the settlements as fit for EU markets. And it's done this also for organic products and dairy products, etc. Now, my point being that the more the EU continues to deepen its relations with Israel, and the more Israel undertakes efforts to erase the green line, the more there is going to be a point of friction. And so far, both Israel and the EU have been very good at insulating the deepening relations from the Palestinian issue. But this cannot go on indefinitely. And I think in this regard, and we have seen this in terms of the Israeli reaction to a lot of what the EU has done, has been, let's be quite frank, the Israeli reaction has been hysterical. For something that is very minor, like labeling or other things, the political reaction and the reaction in the Israeli media has been off the charts. And I think, so while the EU has been trying to respect its own rules and regulations, sometimes failing, but while this is sort of a technical approach, it does carry with it a political message. And it challenges the current discourse within Israel, which has shifted towards the right, which sees settlements and the occupation as being normal and a part of everyday life. The idea of, we see also a rise in annexationist rhetoric in Israel, something that would have been taboo a decade ago or less is now mainstream, and you have an Israeli government which or cabinet members of an Israeli government that either support annexation or at least are not on record as supporting a two-state solution as we understand it. And I think in this regard, and as previous speakers have mentioned, this in-your-face Israeli policy of deepening settlements. Now, this has been the settlement project has been a project of every government since the beginning of the occupation. So Prime Minister Netanyahu is not different in this regard, but what is different is that they're much more explicit and they're much more vocal about what they're doing. And this makes it much more difficult for the EU to continue with the pretense of a peace process when everything the Israeli government says publicly indicates that's not going to happen. So the question is, how do you move Israel and the Israeli public out of their comfort zone? How do you make the status quo untenable? And how do you move Israelis towards the decisions that are needed to deoccupy Palestinian land? And the answer to this, in part, is the undifferentiated nature of Israel's economy. The fact that at the moment you cannot say there is a distinct settlement economy. You cannot say there is a distinct Israeli economy. Yes, of course, you can look at the map, but because of Israeli efforts to integrate settlements to such a degree in the social economic fabric of Israel, they've become like two Siamese twins. And I think this also points to perhaps something else, which is, and a lot of people have talked about the need to ban settlement products. So when I discuss with Palestinian officials or other people these labeling steps or the poultry things that I just mentioned, Palestinian officials tend to be very dismissive, and not just them, Palestinian society, European civil society, many people. But I would point to the simple fact that exports from Israeli settlements to the EU account for only 1% of Israel's total exports. This is a relatively small number. If you were to actually ban settlement products, okay, you'd put some businesses outside in the settlements out of business. And it would obviously send a political message, but the actual impact is not going to be, the financial impact is going to be rather restrained. If you live in Tel Aviv, it won't affect you. You can, most Israelis have been able to insulate themselves from the occupation on a day-to-day level. So they don't really care if some poultry producer in the settlement goes out of business. But going back to what I said about the undifferentiated nature of Israel's economy, I would take two examples very quickly. The first is wine. So yes, you have plenty of Israeli wines that are manufactured in Israeli settlements. But you also have plenty of Israeli wines that are manufactured within Green Line Israel. Yet they use grapes from settlements. And this is the same for poultry, also in Israel up until recently, and dairy products. The EU's line is, we want to trade with you, we want to trade with Israel, but you need to allow us, the EU, to respect our own obligations, our own legal necessity. We don't want to impose ourselves on you, but you have to be able to facilitate us. You need to be able to allow us to continue trading with you, which means forcing Israel to differentiate in its own production lines. Now, this is wine, but what you can if you talk about wine, you can also talk about the financial sector. The fact that Israeli banks play an instrumental role in the promotion and expansion of the Israeli settlement project in terms of the provision of loans and mortgages, etc. At the same time, EU financial institutions are engaged on a daily basis in financial transactions with these Israeli banks. Now, because of the fungibility of funds, at the moment, it is impossible to say whether EU funds that go towards Israeli banks, it's impossible to know if they actually make their way to the settlements. This could be an issue, especially in light of these famous funding guidelines and this obligation to make sure that the EU does not provide any material support to illegal policies. And as an example of this, I would say, and to indulge in a bit of self-promotion, the report that we put out a few weeks ago, the financial part of that report was a very minor component. It created a sense of panic in Israel, in the Israeli financial sector. As a result, several banks lost 3% of their stock value, merely talking about this as an option. So to go back to yesterday, someone said, what is Israel scared of? Well, I would hasten to say Israel is scared of this, is the fact that you start to go after stuff. You start to go after Israeli entities that have links to the settlements, even if they're based outside of the settlements. This is where you start to have an impact. And very quickly, to sum up a few points. First, when it comes to talk of banning settlement products, yes, there is international law as a basis, but the EU has not taken a political decision to move in this direction. There is no political mandate. But there is a political mandate to continue down the path of differentiation. This mandate has been reaffirmed numerous times in EU Foreign Affairs Council conclusions, most recently in July. Now, I think it's very important to say also, to counter Israeli attempts to smear EU actions. The EU is not engaged in BDS. What the EU is doing is, as I said before, merely the result of a legal necessity. That is it. At the moment, the EU has not done sufficient to own the narrative around this differentiation, to explain what it is doing and why it is doing that. The void that has been caused by this has allowed Israel to step in, mischaracterize EU actions and slander EU actions as anti-Semitic. So I think it's very important for all concerned to be very cognizant of what is happening, what the EU is doing. And comparisons with BDS are not, in that regard, helpful. Lastly, let me say that at the current pace the EU is proceeding down this differentiation track, negative developments on the ground will outpace the EU's ability to try to reinforce this green line. What is needed, therefore, is concerted effort to speed up and deepen this differentiation. And this can be achieved through public pressure. After all, European publics are increasingly supportive of Palestinian rights. This pressure brought to bear on EU decision makers and European politicians can have an impact. At the same time, it is very much necessary for Palestinian leaders and Palestinian civil society to continue holding the EU's feet to the fire and pointing out when the EU is deficiently implementing its own legislation. But I would say this track, though, does offer the best means of starting to chip away at Israeli impunity in the occupied territories. This track, it is hoped, if taken to its logical conclusion, will confront Israelis between continuing to deepen relations with Europe or continuing to deepen their hold over the West Bank and the Palestinian territories.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lovatt, for your presentation.